Welcome to the Nanovic Institute lunch event. My name is Clemens Sedmak and I serve as Director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. I would like to welcome you all to our International Holocaust Remembrance event with our guest of honor, Helen Epstein. Let us give us a warm applause for Helen right now. It's such an honor to have you here.
Thank you, Tyler.
Welcome all. Thank you for coming. The United Nations General Assembly designated January 27th, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a time to remember the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of other victims of Nazi persecution. 80 years ago to the day, the concentration camp of Auschwitz was liberated from the Nazis. This is a special day for me. I'm an Austrian, and growing up close to the little-known concentration camp Ebensee brought a sense of the unimaginable atrocities of the Holocaust and the role of both Germany and Austria early on into my education. Then one of my first connections with the Nanovic Institute was a grant to take 8 graduate students to visit Holocaust memorial sites in southern Germany and Austria. It's also important to remember that the trip brought us in connection with the then oldest Austrian Holocaust survivor, Marco Feingold. We visited Dachau, Berchtesgaden, Mauthausen, Schloss Hartheim, Ebensee, and met Marco Feingold, then 104 years old, in Salzburg. We saw him in the synagogue. He opened the door himself, talked to us for 2 hours. And one of the things he said is, don't forget and help to make sure that it is not forgotten. One of the students wrote about this encounter with Marco Feingold. This culmination of personal remembering illustrates for us the ethics of memory in action. Ethics of memory in action. This is what we want to do today. We are so honored to have Helen Epstein with us. Helen is a true cosmopolitan. She was born in Prague in 1947 as a child of 2 Holocaust survivors, grew up in New York City, attended Hunter College High School, and graduated from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Helen Epstein became an instant published journalist while a 20-year-old college student caught in the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Her account was published in the Jerusalem Post, where she worked while an undergraduate studying musicology and literature. She began to freelance for diverse publications, including the Soho Weekly News, the New York Times, or the Washington Post. Helen was the first tenured woman journalism professor in New York University and taught about 1,000 students over 12 years, and there are more students to be taught today. In 1979, Helen Epstein published Children of the Holocaust, one of the first books to examine the intergenerational transmission of trauma from Holocaust survivors to their children. This book became the first of a non-fiction trilogy that includes Where She Came From and The Long Half-Lives of Love and Trauma. Helen has published at least 9 additional books, including Franci's War, a memoir of her mother's life in 2020. Helen Epstein has served as a leading voice among descendants of survivors. She's also active in Holocaust memorialization work in the Czech Republic, where her family is from. In 2022, Helen published the book Getting Through It, a medical memoir of surviving surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. She's an inspiration for tens of thousands of people. It's such a privilege to have you here with us today. Welcome so much. And a word about the choreography. Helen and I will have a conversation for about 26 to 29 minutes. And then we open the floor to any questions or comments you may have. We will end at 1:45, the latest, probably a bit early, because I can see some people move up to the stage and ask you questions afterwards. So again, welcome and thank you so much for being with us, Helen.
Thank you. I have a request for you. I'd love to take a picture. So if you don't want to be in the picture, just cover your face, okay? We're just going to, here with the flowers. I love the flowers. There we go. Thank you. Okay.
memory work. Wonderful. Franci's War. This is a remarkable book, which I read, and I took copious notes. And it has a complex history. It talks about a complex history. Helen, may I ask you, what's your relationship with this book?
Very interesting question. This book has a very unusual history. I edited my mother's manuscript, which I refound after 30 years. When I was writing one of my books, I decided to write a multi-generational family history focusing on the women in my family. Some of you may know the Chinese book, Wild Swans, an amazing intergenerational book. Guys, there's seats here if you want to come. So I wanted to write an intergenerational story, doing history really through women. And this was particularly interesting for me because I did not know my grandmother. My grandmother was murdered in the war, so I never had a grandmother, and I certainly never knew my great-grandmother. So I wanted to reconstruct the maternal line in my family historically, and I was interested particularly in social history, women's history, and cultural history. They were all Jews. They all lived right in the center of Europe, and they were part of the migration, the worldwide migration from rural areas to city areas. And my grandmother was the one who made the transition in 1900. She moved from a small town in Bohemia to Prague. So that's the background. My mother, in 1972, decided to write a memoir of her concentration camp experiences. She called it Round Trip. My mother was very sarcastic, and the round trip was from Prague to concentration camp and back. And she wrote it, she was a quadrilingual language speaker. Her first language was German because her father spoke German. Her second language was Czech because her mother spoke Czech. She was sent to French schools in Prague. She went to the lycée in Prague, and then she learned English. She spoke really good English. She read books by Nabokov in English, so her English was pretty good. And she always used a typewriter to write because she had a correspondence with all of her friends in Prague. So unbeknownst to me and to my two brothers, she started working on a memoir, we think, in 1970, possibly. She was done with it in 1972, for sure. And she wrote it on onion skin paper. There's seats up here if you guys want to sit down. She typed it on onion skin paper in English. And her English, of course, was very good. I didn't know how good until I started working on it, but it's really good. And she tried to sell it to a publisher in 1972. As you may know, in 1972, nobody was publishing books by or about Holocaust survivors except for Elie Wiesel and in Italy, Primo Levi. And she gave up after about, 8 or 9 rejections. Took the manuscript, put it away. She said, by that time, I had finished journalism school. And she said, "You're the writer in the family. You use this in one of your books." So I used it in one of my books in this international thing, and the intergenerational history of women. And I published a book called Where She Came From, which runs from about 1848 to 1948. And it was published in America and all over the world. And there was a German edition. So about 5 years ago, out of the blue, I get an email from Berlin from a guy who says, on page so-and-so of Where She Came From, in your mother, you claim that your mother was in a prison cell with my father's first wife. And you say that she said such and such, and that's wrong. And the reason it's wrong is she wasn't in jail then. She was in jail 4 years later. This is the kind of thing that happens when you're a writer and there's email. So I said, okay. And I went and I dug up this manuscript, this onion skin manuscript. And I went to the page. I went to this description of 1939 when my mother's in a prison cell, not for being Jewish, for some black market stuff that her boyfriend's mother was engaged in. And I faxed him the 3 pages. And he said, "Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. I'll put it on my website." And so I, meanwhile, having looked at this, said, oh, this is really interesting. And I went to the beginning of the stack of papers and I read through the whole thing. Now, remember, she wrote this in 1972. This was now 2018. And I said, all right, this looks really, really interesting. It's about sex. It's about gender. It's about not being Jewish and being in a concentration camp. Not being Jewish, she thought she was Catholic. She had been baptized. She was young. She was 19 when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. This is very relevant. Meanwhile, there had been women's studies, Holocaust studies, Central European studies, all of this stuff in universities. I said, I'll get it published in a university press. So I thought, okay, I'll send it to some friends I know who are academics. I sent it to 6 academics, all women, and they all said, this is dynamite. You got to get this published. And I said, okay. Will your university press publish it? And they wrote back and they said, no, we think you should go to a commercial press. And I said, well, this is 2018. There are tons and tons of Holocaust memoirs around, and it was already rejected by 6 publishers, and it's not my story. I can't go do publicity for it. And they said, doesn't matter, just do it. So I gave it to my literary agent. My literary agent sent it out. Sure enough, I was right. 15 publishers turned it down, but number 16 took it. And number 16 happened to be Penguin, which is, of course, a very big publisher. So I, at that point, set about, because I'm a journalist, I set about fact-checking and annotating it. And then I decided that it would be helpful for students or for younger people who have intergenerational issues with their parents to learn a little bit about my relationship with my mother. So I wrote an afterword to this book, which is about my relationship with my mother and why I decided to undertake this project. That's the full answer.
Wow. One of the many disturbing scenes in the book is when your mother returns to Prague, returns to home, but of course this is not her home any longer. And you mentioned it before, your mother was a very impressive polyglot woman, and you're also cosmopolitan. So when you hear the word home, what do you think was home for your mother, and what is home for you, Helen?
Well, home for my mother, let me read you. I just took a paragraph from this because I thought you could relate much better to this if you heard my mother's words. Now, yes, they are edited by me, but I did very, very light editing. Basically, what I did was she had written one paragraph for the whole book. The whole book had no paragraphing, no chapters, no nothing. So I chopped it up into what I thought would make good chapters. So let me just read you the first paragraph, or maybe 2 paragraphs from the second chapter, because that'll give you a sense of who my mother was and what her home was. She did not speak like me. She had a Czech accent. She was not as fluent as I am because I grew up here. However, in editing her work, I realized she was a fabulous writer, and I basically got my writing chops from her. So this is, I would say, 98% what she wrote. Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia on March 15th, 1939, a bit over 2 weeks after I turned 19. My interest in politics was non-existent, and I was only vaguely aware that all 4 of my grandparents were Jewish. A year earlier, I had become the owner of my mother's haute couture business. That's high fashion. I was carefree, slightly spoiled, and mainly interested in dancing, my business, flirting, and skiing, in that order. My father, Emil Rabinek, was born a Jew in Vienna in 1878. He was the youngest son in a family of Austrian civil servants and a firm believer in assimilation. At the age of 20, he had converted to Catholicism in order to circumvent the Jewish quota at the University of Berlin. Emil Rabinek had fought with the Austrian army during the First World War and welcomed the formation of the Czechoslovak Republic. I'm going to spare you my grandmother. I hope some of you will read about my grandmother in my book, Where She Came From, but that's my mother. Now me. I do not remember Prague as a child. I was taken out in a canvas bag when I was 8 months old in August of 1948. My parents put me on a plane because we were related to a very rich family in Czechoslovakia named the Pečeks, who were like the Rothschilds of Czechoslovakia. My father's family were the poor relations of this family, but they felt responsible towards us. And so my father got a place on the quota of people leaving Czechoslovakia. We flew out, we landed in New York, and we went straight to this hotel, which was the Czech Refugee Hotel, which was across the street from the Museum of Natural History. Those of you who know New York, on 81st Street off of Central Park West. We stayed there for 3 weeks. My mother, ever enterprising, got a sewing machine, but she wasn't allowed to use it in the hotel. So 3 weeks later, we moved to Riverside Drive to a basement apartment. We had to be in Manhattan because she was doing high fashion, and high fashion didn't exist at the time in Brooklyn or in Queens. So I grew up in Manhattan, and there were lots and lots of refugees there at the time. I lived on the Upper West Side of New York, and a very, very integrated multicultural community, Cubans, Blacks, Holocaust survivors of the American blacklist from all over the country. Very interesting to go to public school there in the 1950s.
You're one of the most eminent voices to talk about children of the Holocaust and the second generation. I was struck in your book from 1979 about the mysterious bond between Holocaust surviving families in New York. And now we are moving into the third and maybe fourth generation of Holocaust survivors. What would be your insights or your views on what's to come? Being a second generation, how do you see the third and the fourth?
I really don't know. I have 2 kids. They're older than you. They're in their 30s. I have grandchildren who are younger than you. They're not teenagers yet. And I really don't know what's going to happen to them. I think that they're very, very assimilated. They don't have much of a religious identity. One of my sons lives in New Zealand. He's an academic. The other son lives in California. He designs Rivian batteries, electric batteries. And neither of them are particularly interested in the Holocaust. I would say that they are very sensitive to any kind of issues regarding racial or ethnic discrimination. But I don't think that they are particularly focused on the Holocaust. I think that they grew up with it. They know that all 4 of their grandparents survived the Holocaust in various ways. And they know that it very much affected me because I grew up with no nuclear family at all, except for my parents. So it's really a toss-up. I don't know I think there's some 3rd and 4th generation people who are really obsessed with the Holocaust. And I think there are others who couldn't care less.
And what would that mean for our work of remembering? So I mean, it's a big topic, obviously, in Austria. It's a big topic in Germany. When I came to the United States, I found it's not as present in the United States as from my school days in Austria. What would your hopes be to a proper way of remembering the Holocaust in the future?
Well, I think it depends a lot on national history. You know, I mean, it's really different to study American slavery if you're in Austria, to study it in the United States. I think it's different to study the Holocaust if you're in Germany or if you're in the United States. I think Germany has done a fantastically good job of their historical remembrance. But I also think it's possible to go overboard with Holocaust education and Holocaust history, both within the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community. My kids went to public school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where they had a Holocaust curriculum. The whole class had a Holocaust curriculum, and it had a huge impact on everybody except my kids. I remember once walking in Cambridge and running into 2 Eritrean kids who were in my Eritrean immigrants who were in my kids' class, who I knew fairly well. And I said, "Oh, I haven't seen you. Where have you been?" And they said, "Oh, my mother moved us to the suburbs." I said, "Oh, where?" And he mentioned a suburb. And I said, "Well, how is it?" And he says, "Well, it's all white and people are anti-Semitic." I said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, I noticed people are anti-Semitic." And I remembered our Holocaust course And it really bothers me that people are anti-Semitic, and I want to move back to Cambridge. So that was really interesting. That was what in journalism you call anecdotal evidence of something. And, had I still been interested in pursuing this, I would have gone out there and figured out, what happened here. Was he so impressed by this course that he took as an 8th grader that a couple of years later, he is still reacting to what he learned there? Did he particularly like my son? Were they closer friends than other people? I don't know, but it had an impact. On the other hand, I know people in Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic who just can't stand any more Holocaust education because they've had it 3 or 4 times, the way my kids had Rosa Parks 3 or 4 times, because every time they went to a new school, from middle school to high school to college, they learned about Rosa Parks. And so it's a really difficult question. How and when do you teach Holocaust stuff? And the form in which you do it. Some people do Holocaust tours. A lot of Israelis do Holocaust tours. They go to Auschwitz as a group and they only tour the camps. Or there are summer camps that Jewish summer camps where they take kids and they make replicas of the cattle cars that went to concentration camps. I don't think that's a great idea, but some people do. And so there are many, many ways of remembering. Being a writer, I, of course, am biased towards books. I think it's a good thing to read. I think it's a good thing to see good movies about history. That would be my preferred form of education. But I'm biased, and a lot of people don't read.
That's interesting. I had a visiting professorship in Jena 15 years ago. And then some of the students had a similar, they went overboard with Holocaust education in Germany. And when we were with the Nanovic Institute in Dachau, our tourist guide gave me his card and said something like dark tourism expert. Yeah, exactly. And I sighed. Let's go back to your mother. One of the words of the day is the word resilience. And obviously you yourself are, by all stretches of the imagination, a very resilient woman. And your mother comes across as very resilient in this memoir. The term resilience is difficult. I remember, have you read Thomas Bürgendal's A Fortunate Child?
No.
So, you should. I will get a copy to you. Okay. So the late Thomas Bürgendal was 10 years old when he was born in 1937, when he was brought to a concentration camp from Slovakia. So he's very, very close, right, to Czechoslovakia. And when he was 70 years old, he emigrated to the United States after the war, survived miraculously, found his mother miraculously, came to the United States, became a very successful international human rights lawyer. And then at the age of 70, in 2007, he published this memoir, A Fortunate Child, where he said at the beginning, I know there is a lot of stuff about resilience, and I don't know whether I was resilient or not. I can only say I met the right person in the right moment. And so my question is, what can we learn about resilience reading the book and learning from you as a person in your life?
Well, I think working on this book told me a lot about resilience because it is such a personal book. She's very forthright and candid about things. And one of the first most blatant things I learned was the importance of relationships. A lot of the survivor memoirs that first came out after the war were written by men. And as we know, men, as opposed to women, do not place relationships on the highest plane. And in this case, the women, this is a book written by a woman. It's about all her relationships with women. There are almost no relationships with men in this book. And the reason for that is, of course, the concentration camps were segregated. Women were with women and men were with men. So there wasn't a choice. I mean, she describes one relationship, one friendship she had with a man who was in Auschwitz, who was very kind to her. But it's very peripheral. The major figures in this are women. And she really talks about how important relationships, friendships were, and also sexual relationships. And she really believes that that's what got her through the war, that without talking to somebody else on a regular basis and relying on somebody else with mutual reliance, there was no way she would have gotten through it. And so that was an extremely important thing for me. The second thing, actually, speaking to what you were just talking about, was memory. She relied on her memory and her education an awful lot. I mean, today, you look in the news and you see all these people who survived the California fires, right? All their stuff is gone. All their stuff is gone, unless they had it in the cloud. Their photographs are gone, their mementos are gone. So what's left? What's left is what they carry around with them in their memory. Same thing for people who are going through a medical crisis. I went through a medical crisis 4 years ago. I didn't know whether I was going to live or die. And what got me through it? I thought about working on this book, and I thought about my mother. And I thought, okay, I'm going to call in all my friendship cards from all my life. And I got on my email list, and I got in touch with all my high school classmates. I got in touch with all my neighbors. I was lucky because it was the summer and I live in Massachusetts, so it wasn't the winter. I'm not sure I would have gotten such a response if it was the winter, but everybody came to my lawn and brought me food. It was during COVID. Everybody brought me food. Everybody brought me gifts. It was just great. And I think, got that idea from reading this book. The third thing, I think, was the power of modeling, of role modeling from other people. Now, in my case, my role models were my parents, because my parents both got through this incredible situation more or less okay. And I guess what they would say is that they never gave up and they tried to adhere to a code of conduct that made them feel okay about themselves. My mother describes an episode where she did something, to us it seems silly, but there it was life-saving or life-denying. She hid a can of cherries. She was in a work camp in Hamburg, and she hid a glass preserved cherries thing, which of course was a treasure in the middle of the Second World War. And instead of sharing it with her bunk, where everybody would have gotten one of the cherries and these things, she hid it in an attic. And the Nazi guard who was guarding them found it, and it completely disgraced her in front of her bunk. She never forgot this. She told me this story again and again and again. And of course, here I am in America in the 1950s, where a can of cherries cost 50 cents or something. And I didn't really get it until I read it in her words, how she felt about it. Another thing that she points out in this book, which is also to me seems so trivial, but it bothered her all her life. She, in 1936, because she was a fashion designer and she was with her mother, they went to Berlin to see the fashion shows. And they were staying with a Jewish family. And by that time, Jews couldn't go to the movies. They weren't allowed to go to the movies. And there was a 16-year-old girl in that house in Germany where they were staying. And my mother, age 16, says to her, "Let's go to the movies." And the girl says, "I can't. I'm Jewish. And so are you." And my mother said, "I'm not Jewish. I have a Czech passport. I'm going to the movies." And she went to the movies. I heard about this a lot too. So I got the idea that friendship was really, really important. You save your relationships. You're loyal to your friends. And also, you don't only watch out for yourself. You pay attention to who you're with. 3 things. And, people talk about resilience as though there's resilience and there's damage. Yeah. That's not the way it is. It's all mixed up together. It's people who survived were both damaged and they were resilient, as are people who are discriminated against or prosecuted everywhere. And so if you had parents who were damaged by racism or any other form of discrimination, cut them a little slack and realize that, it's all mixed up together and you've got it. You've inherited it.
Yeah. Start thinking about your questions. We will move into them very soon. It's all mixed up together. I was thinking of your grandparents' different responses. So your grandfather, as your mother describes it, in the camp, he basically gave up and collapsed, having been the provider for the family and very strong before. And your grandmother was the one to hold it together. there's this unpredictability, right? Some people may be resilient in certain contexts and less resilient in others. And that's one of the takeaways I have of the book, The Complexity of Human Nature. I have to admit, I read it with the temptation to think, what is there to learn about human nature? What is there to learn about human nature? And one of the things I think I learned was, well, the complexity of human nature. The way your mother described some of the Nazis and the SS officers, also some complexity in the character. Would you say that that's one of the lessons of the book?
Definitely.
Complexity of human nature?
Definitely. And also your judgments of other people. What you think at one moment may change an hour later, depending on what they do. One of the most amazing stories that I heard, my mother always talked about this stuff, so none of the stuff that's in here is new to me. So one of the stories that everybody loves, and which I kind of have thought about all my life, is about lying, okay? So my mother was on the first transport of prisoners out of Auschwitz. At a certain point in the war, it was decided by the Nazis that they needed more workforce, and particularly needed more workforce in Germany. And so my mother was on the first transport of 1,500 women out of Auschwitz to Hamburg, Germany. How many of you have been to Hamburg? Yeah. So you remember, it's a port city. They had a lot of oil there. It was being bombed by the Allies. It was like Dresden. We in America don't hear so much about the bombing of Hamburg because it was bombed by the British, not by the Americans. However, it was just like Dresden. They firebombed, the city went up in flames, and because there were all these oil wells, it went up even more in flames. So that's where they sent these Jewish prisoners to work, to pick up the bricks, to rebuild, and to do all kinds of stuff in Hamburg. So my mother's on that, she wants to go on that thing, and the rumors are all over Auschwitz that they're going to select the healthiest people. And my mother is very worried about this because she had an appendectomy when she was 13 years old. Here's another example of something that happens 1 year, and then many years later it haunts you. She has to go in front of Dr. Mengele to be selected for this work thing in Hamburg. And she has this scar, an appendectomy scar, and she's worried about it. And and they all have to be naked, of course, to be selected for this work detachment. And so she's thinking, what am I going to do? And she hears all these women around her, all these naked women talking about that they're going to ask what your profession is. And everybody is saying they're a dressmaker because they assume that if they're going to a work camp, that they're going to have to sew uniforms or repair uniforms or do something manually. So she decides her father was an electrical engineer, and she's going to say she was an electrician, which is, I read this. I heard that every time I heard this and every time I read this, I think this is just ridiculous. I mean, it's 1944, and she's going to say she's a woman electrician. I mean, I don't know whether there exists. I never Googled it, but I don't know whether there were any women electricians anywhere in the world in 1944. But that's what she decided to say. So sure enough, that's what she does. And she tells Dr. Mengele, when she came up naked in front of the selection, they ask your name, not your name, your number, and your profession and your age. And she said, straight-faced, that she was an electrician. And he believed her, which also amazed me. I mean, I wouldn't have believed her. But at any rate, the Nazis had such an amazing bureaucracy that when she arrived at the work camp in Hamburg, there was a card that said that there was this electrician coming, and she was employed as an electrician. So back to your point about the complexity of character, the man who ran this work camp where she was in valued her tremendously because he needed an electrician. He needed an electrician for his coffee pot. He needed an electrician for, I don't know, his refrigerator. I don't know what he needed it for, but he needed it for a telephone. And so at some points, he would lend her his leather gloves when she had to climb these electric poles to fix the wires. I mean, that is a story you don't usually hear about in the none of it. Not the lying, not the kind of balls it took to say what she said, and not the fact that this Nazi commandant would lend a prisoner his leather gloves because he was concerned about his kitchen functioning properly. It's an amazing story. It's very complex.
And I mean, I thought it was amazingly brave, borderline what's the word, risky to say electrician, because she found herself in situations that were really, dangerous for her and the rest of the camp working as an electrician, having some idea. She did say she had some idea, having watched her father. My last question, and of course I have a question about God as well, but I spare it for the end. Could you tell, one of the moving, very, very moving bits is the last words of your grandmother to your mother. Would you please be willing to read that and also explain the context, when she took the poison away?
Yeah.
And then the last encounter. Please.
So I come from a line of suicidal women, unfortunately. I have never been suicidal, but my mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother were all suicidal, and my great-grandmother did it. My great-grandmother was very poor. She was living in Vienna. Her first child died of, what was it? I think a form of appendicitis. And she was terribly depressed, and she actually threw herself out a window in Vienna. And I, as a journalist, looked it up in the Viennese newspapers, and there she was. And I went to the cemetery in Vienna. She was buried in a cemetery, and there she is, buried right next to her firstborn son. So the history was that my grandmother, when she did this, was 9 years old. She was soon orphaned because her father also died, and she became suicidal. And then, of course, my own mother was suicidal, maybe because of this heritage, but maybe also because of what went on in the camps. But at any rate, this is back to when this is in Terezin, this scene. And Terezin is the camp that is very close to Prague. And from Terezin, people were separated and some were sent to die. My grandparents were sent to die, and my mother was left in Terezin to work. And some of them got pink slips, and they were actually pink. And some of them got white slips, and my mother stayed. And so this is what my grandmother said to my mother as they were being taken away. Oh, sorry, I forgot one important part. My grandfather also was suicidal. He kept a revolver in his desk to commit suicide, and he also had a vial of pills. And remember, at the beginning of this conversation, we said that my mother had been in jail, in prison in 1939 with the first wife of the guy who wrote to me from Berlin. So when this happened, when she was in this jail for the first time, she got back before her parents did from the jail, and she went through my grandfather's desk and she found a vial of pills. And she figured they were suicide pills. So she took them to a pharmacist while my grandparents were still locked up. And she had them replaced with saccharin because she thought that her parents were suicidal and she was doing a good thing. She was preventing them ever taking their lives. Well, flash forward, there they are in concentration camp. The Nazis are taking them away. And my grandfather pulls out this vial of pills. Imagine this with your parents, if you had done this to your father. And he pulls out his vial of pills and he says, the Nazis are never going to get me. I'll do it first. And at that point, my mother, age, 24, opens her mouth and says, those aren't what you think they are. I had them replaced. They're saccharin. So the last interaction she had with her father was him just screaming at her, saying, who do you think you are, taking away my ability to control my life and death? So this is what she says. This is what my mother says her mother told her as she left. Did you stay with me for all that? Okay. She said, try to forget what your father said last night. I understand why you did what you did. I probably would also have done it 3 years ago. You are a grown woman now, and your place is with your husband. Your father and I have had our lives. We have had some wonderful years, and you have given us much joy and pride. Whatever comes now, we have to face alone and together. You are very young, and your only duty to us is to stay alive. Your life is before you. I know you will be courageous and strong and live to see these evil men punished. God bless you, my little girl. Now, that's very moving, yes. As a journalist, she is recounting a quote from how many years ago? 30 years ago, at least. Did my grandmother actually say that to her? We don't know. But that's what my mother remembered her mother saying to her, her mother's last words to her.
But her emotional memory must have remembered she was calm and encouraging. And she came back to this point, the duty to survive. That's
the duty to survive and not to feel guilty.
It's huge.
And she didn't succeed. My mother felt guilty all her life, which was one of the reasons she tried to commit suicide all the time. But that's what she put in the book.
Thank you, Helen. I open the floor now for any comments or questions you may have.
It's a lot to absorb, I know.
Yes, please. There is a mic somewhere.
Thank you very much for talking. One of the lessons, I think, is that when you have a society run by an autocrat and you don't look like me, this is one of a number of cases where I think it's terrible. And I think that should be mandatory parts of the history that we learn. And here in America, of course, we also have had that kind of history. Some of my information about the Holocaust, I haven't read any of your books, but I found one, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago called The Forgotten Holocaust. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it had a lot to do with the details of what happened in Poland. And at the time, Poland had the highest number of Jews there.
Right.
Russia was second. Germany, I think, was third. But anyhow, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. If there are no questions, I will ask my God questions. So please.
I really would like to hear your questions.
I found that so moving and inspirational. I'm visiting Notre Dame from Galway in Ireland, and my daughter is doing a semester here, and I was saying, what can I do today to, and I knew it was International
Holocaust
Remembrance Day, and so then I just looked up Notre Dame, and this is how I landed here today. But my question to you is around education and of the impact of education and how it, for example, in Ireland, our current Prime Minister, he was a teacher, and the first thing he brought in was free education. Well, he actually, the most important thing that transformed Ireland to what it is in modern day Ireland was free education. And then when it came to third level, practically it is free as well. And that transformed our people into a very educated people. And so now I'm looking for, in the context of on education in a place like America, what are your thoughts on education and disinformation is the word I was trying to think of.
Wow.
I know that was a big question.
Well, I'm a public school kid. I went to public schools all my life, all the way through until I went to graduate school. I was in public education. So I'm a big fan of public education. I'm a big fan of integrated education. I went to school with all kinds of people, and it really, really changed my life. So yeah, I am not a big fan of parochial education, not for Jews, not for Muslims, not for Christians. I don't know how unpopular that is to say here, but that's how I feel.
Irakli and then Czech.
Thank you so much for the insights and taking us to your the journey of your family. There is something a lot of families went through, but rarely people have the courage and motivation to share it to the larger public, as you did. We've seen that in many contexts, historical traumas such as like Soviet repression, forced displacements affect families and kind of become intergenerational traumas. And do you see any similarities between or the parallels between the intergenerational traumas of the Holocaust survivors and that of the other communities that have endured systematic oppression and the violence?
Iraq is a graduate student from Georgia.
Oh, certainly. Now, growing up in the United States, as I said, I had friends from all communities. My closest friend in journalism school was from Chicago. She was from the south side of Chicago. She's become a very famous journalist. Her name is Margot Jefferson. And I got to know her very, very, very well because she was my roommate for many years. And as I was writing Children of the Holocaust, which was my first book about intergenerational trauma, I thought a lot about African Americans in the United States, but I thought specifically about her family because I knew her family very well. Her father was a very prominent doctor in Chicago. Her mother was a social worker. They were the first generation of prominent Black people in Chicago, and they belonged to this circle of prominent Black people in Chicago. One of them owned all the magazines that were the Johnson family, Ebony, and all of those magazines. But because of my personal connection with her and her family, I knew the family history. I knew that they were driven out of Mississippi at gunpoint. I knew how they, long before, anybody wrote about this diaspora of Blacks to the north, I knew it from her because it was her story. All of her family was alive, at least, as opposed to mine. I mean, she knew her grandparents. She knew the family went to California and to Chicago and all over the place. But because I knew this history and because I knew Armenian history, I had read about the Armenians. And when I was in journalism school, we read this particular article by Michael Arlen about his grandparents and his parents. I could see my story in their stories. And so when I was beginning to write Children of the Holocaust, I already had these observations. I had seen in other communities how the intergenerational thing played out. And then I could apply it to my own family. So that's one of the reasons I think multiculturalism is an important thing in daily life. And it's also why I think multicultural studies is a very important thing. So, and you do find it in every group. I mean, every single group that goes through a disaster, the kids of these people in California or in Asheville, North Carolina, are going to have to deal with a lot of this stuff with their parents because their parents were traumatized by this event and they themselves were traumatized by this event. So that's a non-political traumatization. But in the case of wars and in the case of genocide, it's all the worse. Thank you.
Thank you again for being here today. I'm Jack. I'm a sophomore here. You mentioned that your mother didn't necessarily identify as Jewish at the start of all this, and that her father had converted to Catholicism. Kind of once these events were set into place, how did that change, if at all, her own perception of her identity? And how did the ethnic versus religious side of being Jewish interact during the Holocaust for those that went through it?
Well, in my mother's case, it's kind of funny. I mean, people have to laugh. My mother learned about Judaism in concentration camp. I mean, can you imagine? You have to go to concentration camp to learn about Judaism. But she said that in Terezin, for example, where there was more room for this kind of thing than in Auschwitz, Auschwitz was really a survival situation. You couldn't spend energy on anything except surviving. But in Terezin, they used to have lectures. And she'd go to lectures about Judaism. She'd learn about the Bible. She'd learn about Jewish practice. She'd learn about Zionism in the concentration camp, which is, I thought, always very funny. And there were people there who were very Jewish identified. And after the war, when she came out of the camps and came back to Prague, she realized that as much as she felt Czech, she also was perceived as a Jew. And she made up her mind that if she had kids, she was going to teach her kids that they were Jewish, which is one of the reasons I wound up going to school in Israel, to college in Israel, because I didn't get much Jewish stuff, tradition in my family. My father came from a small town. My father was a jock, by the way. My father was an Olympic athlete. He played water polo for Czechoslovakia. And again, he was more identified as a Czech than he was as a Jew. And so he didn't have much to transmit to me in terms of Jewish stuff. And so I said, okay, I'm going to Israel. And I went to Israel, and that's where I learned about Judaism in Israel. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here with us today and sharing your time with us. My name is Taven. I'm a senior here. And we were just curious about I really liked the story that you shared of your mom and how she lied in order to move herself out of the position that she was in into what they believed would be a better position. But this came after the conversation that you had about relationships. And obviously her lying about this wasn't only her lying to the guards, but lying to the women around her, especially when she was a dressmaker. So what do you believe, or what was your mom's opinions about having to manage these relationships while also taking care of herself and keeping that promise to her grandma?
Well, she didn't lie to the people around her. The people around her all knew she was a dressmaker. You have to remember, all these people were Czech. So like half the people on this train going out came from Prague, and they all either knew her or knew about her and knew her as a dressmaker because she was my grandmother was a dressmaker and she was a dressmaker. So there was no question of lying to the other people. What's interesting is none of the other people said, she's really a dressmaker. I mean, everybody kept quiet. And I'm not sure how many other people really heard what she said. It was only afterwards that they found out what she said. But to your point, when you're a kid, I don't know whether you still into this, whether you grew up with this, but when I was a kid, one of the key stories of my childhood was George Washington and the cherry tree, and he can't tell a lie. And this we heard 100 times a year, George Washington never told a lie, which of course is nonsense. But that's what we believed. And here was my mother, whose key story was, I told a lie and it saved my life. So I had a very conflicted idea about lying and the morality of lying.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this. You mentioned the role that books and movies can have on Holocaust education. I was wondering if your mom had a book or movie that she thought represented the reality of the Holocaust well.
My mother's favorite author about the Holocaust was Primo Levi, the Italian. I don't know how many of you know Primo Levi, but she adored him. She thought he was brilliant. He was a chemist by trade who turned into a writer. He was Italian. He was from Torino. And that was her favorite writer. In terms of her favorite movie, I don't know, because, she died a long time ago. She died in 1989. So I don't know. I think she really liked French movies about the Holocaust, but I can't remember exactly which ones were already made. I don't know whether I'm misremembering the ones, but I would say for books, Primo Levi, and for movies, French movies. Also, they're fantastic Czech movies about the Holocaust. The one that my father adored was called The Shop on Main Street. And I really recommend that movie. Another movie that's very good is Closely Watched Trains. And, they all have subtitles, so you can see them.
Thank you. Notre Dame is a special relationship with Primo Levi in the library. There's a lot of material. Just check it out. Yes, please.
Thanks for doing this, but I was wondering, how old was your mother at the end of the Holocaust?
She came back to Prague in 1945, and she was 25 years old. When Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, which was when things got really tough for Jews, she was 19 years old.
Thank you for being here. I also, I'm personally a film major, and so I wanted to talk about the movies as well. That really resonated with me when you said it was a good way to remember. I had a conversation with a film scholar about the film The Zone of Interest, and they told me, oh, there are too many Holocaust films, we already know, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, and I just was confused, and they just had this boredom. And how would you respond to people that say that there's an overinflation of Holocaust movies instead of just them being a way to remember or a new perspective?
Well, I think when people say that, either they've been inundated with it in school, because, in school, some of you probably know this yourselves, you get it again and again and again, which is not a good thing. But I think there's another thing. I think that there are many, many groups that deserve films about their history. And unfortunately, a lot of them don't get them. I mean, there are people in this country who think there are too many Black films, I don't happen to think so. I think every film about African-American history is really interesting and really unusual. But that's because I have a close friend whose history I know, and I can never get enough of it. But there are other people, Cubans in this country. I mean, I don't know whether anybody here is Cuban, but when in 1960, there were a whole bunch of Cuban refugees that came to New York City. I happened to meet some of them. They went to school with me. I've always been interested in Cuban history. Nobody really makes films about what happened to those Cubans. We know that we now have a Secretary of State who's the son of Cuban refugees, but we don't really know why he is the way he is. I think Marco Rubio, we'd know a lot more about Marco Rubio if somebody had made a couple of films about Cuban refugees in Florida. But Armenians. I happen to love Armenian food, so I talk a lot to the people who own the Armenian restaurant near me, and I've read a lot about Armenian history, and I like yogurt, and I like stuff, the dolma, but I haven't seen a lot of films about the Armenian genocide or the results of and there are Armenians. The Armenian diaspora is all over the world. You go to California, you go to Paris, they're everywhere, and we don't have them. The other day in Chicago, I had a taxi driver who identified himself as Assyrian to me. I said, "Oh, Assyrian?" I said, "You're Syrian or you're Assyrian?" He said, "I'm Assyrian." And I said, "Well, how many Assyrians are there left in Syria?" He said, "About 2%. And he said, "We're scattered all over the world. We're all over the place." I said, "Well, tell me about it. Tell me about Assyria. Have you ever heard of a film about Assyrians?" No. The last time I heard about Assyria was when I studied ancient history. I had no idea there were Assyrians among us. But that's the role of film and books, and increasingly film, because as you know, how many people here have read a book this week? Not for school.
Oh, I'm a teacher. Yes, I read it.
See, that's very encouraging.
The week is young. It's only Monday.
Oh, all right.
Ask on Friday, and then everybody will have it.
Right. But the thing is, the role of film and the role of video is super, super important. Super, super important, because it's a way of getting to know other cultures and other people. And by the way, for those of you who are freshmen or sophomores, the one thing I wish I had taken in college, which I didn't, was comparative religion, because that is a course that should be mandatory.
So my last question is in or around the same thing. I have 2 children who are digital natives born in 2002, 2004. And it was around the way that the story is told by movies and by Netflix. And so Ireland has a history, as you know, of oppression and religious oppression. And in fact, Cillian Murphy is in a novel that was translated into a movie this year about Ireland in, I forget what it's called. Does anyone know what it's called? I just saw it before I came over here. And the oppression of the the Catholic Church in Ireland in the 50s. And that's what the whole movie is about. I think it's been nominated for an Oscar, but anyway, the novelist, the book itself was excellent. But my question is around the digital natives, because my own children, they don't read books, they read digital books, the paper book. My husband is gripping onto the paper book. He's started collecting libraries of books because he believes that he's afraid about the demise of the paper book. But it's all about knowledge transfer. And my mother uses a term, it's how you tell it. And so that means that Netflix and movies, how the story is told, there will always be infinite ways of how the story is told. The story will be told poorly, inaccurately, factually, they're all told to evoke a response. And so you kind of have answered the question there, that you see the digital, all of the young people here are looking at the words from a digital point of view. Maybe not at that. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I think we discussed it.
Oh yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, just answered it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us today. This has all been really informative. And I think something that I found really interesting was this idea talking about how maybe people are, tired of learning about certain things that they're told over and over again, how Americans are tired of learning about Rosa Parks, and people, maybe the Holocaust education in certain places is too much. And I wonder your perspective, do you think it's too much, or do you think that there's not enough of other things? So is it that we're learning too much about the Holocaust, we're learning too much about Rosa Parks, or we're not learning enough about the Armenian genocide? We're not learning enough about Native Americans and the effects on them, right? So is it a lack of balance, or is it a lack of priorities in that sense?
I think it's both. And I think it depends a lot on where you're brought up, what part of the country you live in, and I think it depends on what kind of school you went to. I mean, there are many different kinds of schools in this country, There are parochial schools. There are private schools. I live in New England. I live in a place where prep schools are like so big. And I have to tell you, some of them are very, very good, but they're very, very, very exclusive. And because I'm a public school person, I made sure my kids went to public schools. In fact, we moved because I wanted my kids to go to public schools. So that's one thing, that it's very different where you are and what kind of schooling you have and what kind of faculty you have. I mean, my kids school was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's called the People's Republic of Cambridge because it's so progressive. However, when my kids went to school, the teachers union was extremely traditional, and it was so traditional that it spawned a whole movement of alternative school education. So my kids went to alternative public schools, if you can imagine what that is. So what that means is that they had some very interesting educational ideas, like they had double grades. They went to K in 1 and 2 and 3, and that was great for some of the kids. And also it was a numerically, systematically integrated school between Haitian refugees and white people. And so what that meant was that every class in my kids' school was 55% Haitian and 45% white. As Jewish kids, my kids were maybe 1% of the population. And it was a very interesting experience for them, and I'm very glad they had it. Their teachers, however, because they were in this alternative school movement, they were like lunatics with educational reform, which was great for math. My kids were taught math in a very, very good way. They really understand math in a way that I don't, because I learned it by rote. However, history, disaster. They learned Rosa Parks and Holocaust every other year. It was really, really overkill. So it depends where you go to school and how you're taught. If I had my way, I would do a kind of comparative genocide course, and I would go through many different examples of people who have had histories of intergenerational trauma. And I would start in this country with the American Indians, with the Native Americans. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been to the Native American Museum in Washington. Can you raise your hand if you've been there? Yeah, I mean, it's relatively small number, and we all live on land where there were Native Americans not so long ago. I mean, my state of Massachusetts is named after Indians, and my kids began to learn a little bit about Native Americans in this progressive, in fact, their school was called Graham Parks, named after, guess who? Rosa Parks, who I adore, but, it was in the air they breathed. So I would begin with the Indian Americans, and my kids took this Holocaust curriculum where they did learn about the Indian Americans, and they learned a lot about the Irish, by the way, because Boston is a hotbed of Irish. And so we learned about the Irish famine, and then they learned about the Holocaust, and they learned about the Chinese railroad workers in California. But, there's so many populations that were persecuted and that were killed. So there's no dearth of material.
Thank you. One last question. Yes, sir. The last question. Use it wisely.
All right, cool. Thank you. My name is Carl. I'm a junior here. And I thought it was really interesting, just the point you brought up about just going to public schools. Like, I know, like, growing up, like, my mom, she asked me if I want to go to private schools. I said I don't want to do it. I don't think it'd be good for my development as a person, just to sort of kind of be secluded from like the world, just going to private schools. But now I'm at Notre Dame, which is funny. But I guess what do you think are, like, because I know you went to public schools and your kids went to public schools. I guess, like, I guess what are sort of the benefits that you see in public schools, and and why do you think that most people should go to public schools instead of go to private schools?
Thank you. I basically believe in meeting people who aren't like you. I find it interesting. I find, I've always had friends from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different traditions, and I continue to be like that. I mean, here I am, this white Jewish Czech person living in Lexington, and my latest bunch of friends are a bunch of Indians from Bombay, and they're 39. And I really like it. it's really interesting to me to spend time with them. I'm a little alarmed by some of their ideas. I mean, there are people, they don't believe in legacy media, which really offends me and really hurts me as a journalism professor. And I can't seem to convince them that it's a better idea than listening to your random vlog or website. But it enriches my life to know these people. And it enriched my life to have a roommate from the south side of Chicago, I can tell you that. And that's the way I like to live. That's why I'm here at Notre Dame. I mean, I get a lot of invitations to talk all over the place, and I really prefer to talk to people I don't know. I was here 10 years ago. I spoke at the Jewish synagogue community because one of my high school classmates was president of it. And I was delighted when I got this invitation because I like meeting different kinds of people. And I think that's what this country is about and what makes it the country it is. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Helen. Now I ask my last question, which is the God question. And then we ask last comment. And then we bring this plane to a land. You know, every event in Notre Dame, which is a faith-based place, we ask about God. That's what we do. And so, having read Franci's work carefully, on page 56, she writes, God had obviously forsaken us. Mm-hmm. On page 216, she's skiing. I'm proudly saying to you as an Austrian, if there was a God, I could feel God's presence now. So where is God in the story?
In the story, good. I'm glad you asked in the story. I was really getting scared here. Where is God in this story? Yeah, I think that the skiing part really is very, very much the core of my mother's thinking about God. My mother believed that God was in the beautiful things in life. And skiing was one of the beautiful things in life. Nature was one of the beautiful things in life. Nabokov was one of the beautiful things in life. Fashion was one of the beautiful things in life. Children were one of the beautiful things in life. I think for her, God was in what you valued and what you found, I guess, saintly.
Thank you so much. Helen, your last comment, how can we continue with our journey? What would you...
I would urge you to read. My kids don't read. I have lots of books that you can read. If you like reading short, I think you should read this. I think you should read this, and you can read my afterword. And then if you like it, then you can look up my other books. I do have a website. It's just my name, and you can see all my books there. If you're theater buffs, I unfortunately have not written about film, although I have a friend who writes about film. My theater book is about this very famous New York City producer called Joe Papp, who started Free Shakespeare in the Park, and then they started Free Shakespeare everywhere else in America because of him. And I've also written, if you're into classical music, I've written a book about classical musicians, which is all these things are online for like $1 because they're all old. And and this one you can actually read while you're on the exercise bike or jogging. This is an audiobook also. And some of the others I've written are audiobooks too. So please read. And if you read, please leave a review on Amazon and let me know what you thought.
So really, I can recommend this book very, very warmly. Helen, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you. You're welcome. I also want to thank all of those who have made this event possible, our tech friends, our event friends and managers. Thank you for coming and enjoy the rest of the day, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you.